Chapter 7. To Catch a Fish. On the morning of the fourth day at sea, Rick and Backer divided the second orange and passed the meager sections around. By this time, Bartek, DeAngelis, Reynolds, and Alex had gone close to 96 hours with nothing but an eighth of an orange to eat. Under normal circumstances, they took in 2,500 calories a day. In the last 4 days, they had consumed 20. Under their reddening skin, blood and liver, muscles and brain waged a battle against starvation. On a normal diet, the body converts food into glucose, a form of sugar, and consumes it for energy. The men had exhausted the supply of food in their bodies 3 days ago. Since then, their cells had been burning stored fat for energy instead of glucose. Already their faces had begun to thin. Bones looked a little more prominent. Now their bodies dug deeper for fuel. Their vital organs harvested protein from muscle tissue in order to keep functioning. Without a new supply of fuel, each man's body was literally consuming itself to stay alive. Rickenbacker's speech to the men took on a different tone this morning. "You might as well sit down and prepare for a long ride," he told them. They would end up on an island somewhere if they drifted long enough. There was no question in his mind about that. The challenge would be to survive until they did. The men were fast discovering the cruel irony behind being stranded in the ocean. They were starving, and yet they were surrounded by food. The water teemed with sleek, silvery fish, from tiny fingerlings to foot-long jack mackerel and plump-looking dolphins. Seabirds circled overhead, diving occasionally to catch their lunch. The men seemed to have attracted their own traveling ecosystem, but all of it lay just beyond their reach. They had fish hooks and line, but without food they had no bait, and without bait they had no food. The orange peels held no interest at all for the fish. Rickenbacker tried adding Adamson's shiny keychain as a lure. Whitaker tied his ring to a line and sunk it. Sometimes a fish would get curious and hover near a hook, so close the men could almost taste it. Each time, it would lose interest and dart away. They debated trying to turn the tables on the sharks and convert the fearsome predators into prey. Cherry could probably put a bullet into one of them at close range. But if he didn't kill it, what would happen? The wounded creature would flail around, trailing blood in the water. Imagine the 12-foot monsters thrashing around the rafts, whipped into a frenzy by the scent of blood. They decided it was best to let the sharks be. The seabirds were another source of frustration. At first, they had seemed a surefire sign that land was near. Now it was clear the men had misunderstood the habits of seabirds. These creatures were perfectly at home many miles from land. They taunted the men, darting and hovering in sight, but well out of reach. It's not as though the scrawny birds would be much of a meal, but if they could just get their hands on one, they might be able to use the meat for bait. Cherry kept his .45 caliber pistol in his lap during the day. Every now and then he'd take a shot, but he never came close to hitting a bird. Bartek tormented himself by watching the birds fish. They'd flap low, scanning for prey, and then drop with a splash. An instant later they rose with a meal, just like that. Bartek wasn't normally much of a philosopher, but his sister's death, and now his own close encounter with the end, had pushed his mind to a dark place. All around them, creatures with brains no bigger than the tip of Bartek's little finger found food with ease. Here they were, 8 members of the smartest species on Earth. Between them, they had decades of education and specialized training. Bartek himself knew how to fix some of the most complex machines ever made. But out here, it was all meaningless. All they could do was pray that a careless bird might drop a fish in their laps. Day 4 turned to 5, and 5 to 6. Adamson could barely move his arms, but each day he scratched the date onto the side of the raft. October 24th. October 25th. October 26th. The men started passing Bartek's Bible around and choosing passages to read. Whitaker mostly kept his mouth shut when they did. He wasn't a believer. What good was praying going to do? They were on their own out here. Each night they sent up flares until they got one to work. When it burned out and left them in darkness, it made them feel like the only people left in the world. On the fifth morning, they gave up on Rickenbacker's rationing plan and ate the third orange. It was dry as the inside of their mouths. The last one started to rot, and they devoured it on the sixth day. Now the real torture set in. For the first few days, they had at least been able to look forward to something, even if it was a tasteless piece of orange they could eat in one bite. By the time the sun baked off the chill of the fifth night and began to roast them alive, they had nothing left but a relentless need for food. They were desperately thirsty, too, but right now it was hunger that held them captive every waking minute of the day. As if they could lay out their fantasies on a table and carve them up, the men dreamed up 5-course meals in their heads and shared them with one another. Captain Cherry posed as a waiter at one of San Francisco's finest restaurants. He went around the rafts, taking orders. There was always fruit juice to start, then steaks and roasts and chops and turkey. Everyone wanted lemon, their bodies starving for vitamin C. The milkshakes from the officers' club at Hickam Field were in high demand, and strawberry was the flavor of choice. If they ever got off the rafts, they agreed they'd all have one another over for dinner. Bartek offered up his mother's Polish meatballs and cabbage, with apple pie for dessert. DeAngelo said his mother would make spaghetti. Reynolds invited everyone to his parents' ranch in Northern California, where they'd feast on fried chicken, followed by cake and pie. Bartek managed to keep his sense of humor for a while. When the men in the Air Transport Command traveled, they collected $6 a day from the Army for expenses. One thing about being lost at sea, Bartek said, the expenses were pretty light. He ended every day by tallying up their earnings. Well, he'd say, that's another $6 for us. It was good for a few laughs, but nothing could keep their minds off food for long. Rickenbacker watched with irritation as hunger and exhaustion tore away at the morale of the crew. Simple tasks took almost heroic effort, and the rafts required constant attention. Between the sea spray and tiny leaks in the canvas, water collected incessantly at their feet. To stay afloat, everyone had to help bail out the rafts. They used the collapsible rubber buckets and sometimes their hats to shovel water back into the sea, only to watch it fill the bottom of the rafts again. When they weren't bailing, someone was laboring over the hand pump, trying to keep invisible leaks from deflating the rafts. During the first couple of days, it was a 15-minute task to get the side tubes fully blown up. Now, one man had trouble finishing it without handing the pump over to a raft mate and collapsing from fatigue. It was hard work just staying afloat, and the men were beginning to wonder if there was any point in doing it. Despite Rickenbacker's pep talks, DeAngelis had decided after the third day that they were pretty much doomed. Pain had turned Adamson into a bitter, grumbling lump in the corner of Rickenbacker's raft. Radio man Jim Reynolds, who was thin to begin with, had started to waste away. He barely said a word and looked like he wouldn't last long without food. Sergeant Alex looked the worst of the lot. A white paste had formed at the corners of his mouth. He sat in the donut and moaned for water, or mumbled the name of his girlfriend over and over. Her nickname was Snooks, and it took a while for the men to figure out what he was talking about. Finally, Rickenbacker got tired of listening to the moaning. In his mind, despair was a contagious disease, and Alex was showing symptoms. If they were going to survive out here, everyone had to believe it was not just possible, but certain. Any sign of doubt had to be stamped out quickly and ruthlessly, no one could be allowed to quit. He roped the donut in close and lashed out at Alex. "Why the hell can't you take it?" he demanded. After all, Alex wasn't the only one suffering, and there were thousands more boys out there fighting for their lives in unbearable conditions. American soldiers stuck in waterlogged foxholes, eating meager rations of rice and beans. Alex explained meekly that he'd been recovering from jaundice and appendicitis. He'd only been out of the hospital for a couple of weeks, and he'd gotten some kind of lip or gum infection. He also admitted he'd been leaning over the side of the donut and drinking the salt water. "I tried not to, but I had to," he moaned. "I just had to have water." Rickenbacker turned away and let the donut drift back to the end of its 20-foot tether. They'd better find food and water soon, he thought, or Alex wasn't going to make it. Hunger filled the empty hours of the day and night. Their minds groped for solutions, real or imagined. At one point, Cherry was baiting a hook with yet another useless piece of orange peel when he wondered out loud if fingernails would work as bait. Bartek said no. It would take a real piece of flesh to make a fish bite. "What part would you use?" asked Whitaker. Bartek claimed he'd use an earlobe, because they don't serve any purpose. "You'd never miss it," he said. Whitaker suggested the tip of a finger. Reynolds wanted to use a piece of toe because no one would ever notice it was missing. It had started as idle chatter, but everyone knew it was a real option. They needed bait, and if they had to use their own flesh, shouldn't they do it? Adamson warned that the blood from a fingertip or an earlobe might aggravate the sharks. That didn't seem like much of a threat after a week at sea with their constant companions. But no one was quite ready to slice off an earlobe for the chance of catching a fish. The conversation passed with all body parts intact. The talk of using human flesh as bait, however, brought them uncomfortably close to a last-ditch measure that no one was willing to mention aloud. At sea, when men grew desperate enough, they had been known to eat one another to survive. In 1820, the whale ship Essex was rammed by a giant sperm whale about 2,500 miles east of where the three rafts were now drifting. In 3 months lost at sea, the 8 survivors of the Essex consumed 7 of their companions. In one case, they didn't even wait for a boatmate to die. They drew lots, and the unlucky sailor who picked the short stick was sacrificed for a meal. They drew again to decide who would shoot him. The practice was common enough that it was part of an unwritten code known as the custom of the sea. As long as the lots were drawn fairly, no court of law considered it murder. Most sailors had to be on the verge of death before they resorted to cannibalism, but everyone had a different threshold. It took the castaways from the Essex 2 months before they started saving dead bodies for food. In 1884, the crew of the English yacht Mignonette lasted 20 days before they killed and ate their 17-year-old cabin boy. Rickenbacker, Whitaker, Bartek, and the rest of the crew had now been adrift for a week.
Wow. What an incredible...
Chapter 8.
No, wait.
Out of the Sky.
What an incredible chapter. Sad. I do want to go back to some of the pictures. I had to go through some of the captions and some of the images. The survivors of the yacht Mignonette shocked the world in 1884 when news came out that they had killed and eaten their cabin boy. And there was an image there. So this was actually an image from the newspaper, the London News. And you can see the date up here, kind of small, but you could see. And this is when they showed, the ship and what it looked like, their rescue boat. And then I wanted to go back to another one. Hold on. Okay. Americans share the meat as wartime necessity. To meet the needs of our armed forces, fighting allies, and government order limits the amount of meat delivered to stores and restaurants. To share the supply fairly, all civilians, civilian is anybody who is not in military, so we're all civilians, are asked to limit their consumption, eating, of uh, beef, real lamb, mutton, and pork to 2.5 pounds per person per week. And then it says your fair weekly share, and by age, you can add these foods to your share: liver, sweetbreads. Sweetbreads are brains, kidneys. I guess sweetbreads are not brains. Brains and other rarity meats, also poultry and fish. Help win the war, keep within your share. So during the war, people were eating less meat, and because there was less meat available. Remember, all the soldiers had come from farms and cities and had to leave work. So the farming opportunity and the share of meat might have gone down. There wasn't as much meat because all the soldiers, some of which who were farmers, were not on the farms anymore. So I thought that was interesting. I wanted to share that. And what a sad chapter, huh? Talking about having to cut off your earlobes or other body parts just to survive. Yeah. Okay. Gives you something to think about. Survival. What survival techniques do we need at different times in our life? And that's a pure survival mode. I was thinking about surviving, what's happening now with COVID-19, having to stay home, having to change everything about your life. There's a survival component about that is easier for some people than for others. Just like in the rafts, some people are okay and managing, and other people are not managing well at all. So we all have different abilities and different thresholds and different, backgrounds that make us stronger or not strong enough. So I thought that was interesting. Okay, guys, now you go to questions.